Mr. Kevin McCarthy, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. So, you are the author of the book Blindspots, as well as a accomplished public speaker, former president of the National Speakers Association, the Oregon chapter, as well as a guy who, and we'll talk about this a little bit, who spent 30 months in a federal prison for a crime you didn't knowingly commit. So we've got a lot to cover today. So why don't we just kind of jump in and just help those who may not be familiar with you come up to speed about where your life's journey has taken you and how you've arrived at the place you are today.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on your broadcast here.
Sure.
Hey, so my inclination, of course, is to start with the 33 months in federal prison for a crime I didn't knowingly commit.
Yes.
But let me lay a little backdrop to that for the listeners. So it goes back to, first of all, I had a radical conversion to Christianity in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
So it changed my life in every way you can imagine. And my entrepreneurial thread through my family bled over into me, and so I've been an entrepreneur as long as I can remember. So I opened up a real estate office in the late 80s.
Sure. Very successful one.
Yeah, it actually grew to the 13th largest Century 21 franchise in the country.
Wow.
Out of 6,000, so it was a real blessing.
Yeah.
And it was, of course, a lot of God involved in that and some good strategic planning.
Yes.
And execution, right? And while I was sitting on the board of directors for a number of Century 21 franchisees in that local Phoenix area, I was asked to give a presentation. First time I'd ever really given a presentation outside of church. In church, I had done sermons and been asked as a lay leader to get behind the pulpit. But the church is a lot more forgiving.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to go give a presentation to 31 business owners. And apparently it went pretty well because I was asked to end up giving 5 paid keynote presentations. And this is 1994, so it was the first time I ever was paid to speak.
Do you remember how you felt walking into that first business meeting where you had to present? Even though you had some public speaking experience, did you feel a sense of like butterflies in the stomach, impending dread?
Horrible.
Yes.
Horrible. In fact, that doesn't stop necessarily for years. I mean, it just takes practice, getting out and becoming more and more confident. Yeah. And there is a shift that takes place once you begin to get outside of yourself and realize that you're there for the people that are listening. So it's a mental shift, and it takes a while to do that. And it's, there's no short circuit for that. It's just practice.
So that one speaking gig then led to something a little bit larger.
Yeah, quite a bit, actually. 5 paid events, which then led to a 14-state contract with Century 21. And that led to then just going national. I ended up selling my real estate company and developing a full-blown speaking seminar business.
Interesting.
During the mid to late 90s.
So this one thing that you had been doing in terms of running a real estate firm, suddenly you get one opportunity to go into a speaking opportunity, and then that begins to scale up to the point where you leave aside the successful real estate firm to then go into the speaking and training circuit.
Right.
My goodness. So tell us a little bit about kind of the decision-making process that you went through to transition from real estate into speaking and training.
Yeah, real estate. So backing up, for me as an entrepreneur, I'm a hunter-gatherer. It's like I want to go out and build something, but I don't want to continue just to run it long term. So I was at this place 5 years into our business that business was going great, and I realized that this whole new idea of speaking and developing something there was a lot more exciting. So I sold my interest in the real estate company and built a whole new division, a whole new company, basically. Sure. So that was sort of the impetus behind it. It's like, okay, just that little bit of restlessness of the entrepreneur in me wanting to build something.
I see. Interesting.
In fact, my son's an artist, and not a professional artist, but he's just amazing. And I describe myself as an artist as well, but my art is business.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So was it the speaking business that ended you in jail? How did that come about?
Yeah, no, that was a progression. So while I was traveling around the country, speaking in pretty much every state, I think, except for Maine, I don't know why, I was getting the idea in the sense, this is 1994, this is when the internet was a new concept from a commercial standpoint within the real estate sector. We had no idea how it was going to impact us. I researched that, and that's what led me to the speaking. And so while I was on the road, I realized that these realtors needed help getting their listings onto this new thing called the internet.
The internet, imagine.
And so I, not knowing anything about programming, but understanding project development, I hired some programmers and we developed the first of its kind system that would pull those listings out of the multiple listing service computers and put them onto the internet.
This is like a first draft of a Zillow.
Yeah, way early. In fact, we launched 6 months before Realtor.com launched. Obviously, we were both on the same trail, same path together. Yeah. But then Realtor.com tried to buy my company. I said no, and that was kind of stupid. They were going to go public, and I didn't even know what that term meant from a stock offering standpoint, right?
Okay.
Then Homeseekers.com, their number 2 competitor, offered to buy my company a few months later, and by this point I'd smartened up and said yes. And so I sold my company to Home Seekers for a substantial sum of stock and cash, and then a presidency role with this publicly held company. Well, that lasted about 10 months.
Oh.
And then the bubble burst.
Yeah,
the
sure.
.com bubble.
Yeah,
in
2001, 2002, yeah.
And so when the bubble burst, Homeseekers.com lost their funding. I was the newest division on the block, so they cut my division, and next thing you know, they're going out of business. In the process, this is where it led to prison. So in the process, I ended up getting a consulting offer from a company which I had invested in.
Oh, okay.
And that's a long story.
Sure.
So the short version is a buddy of mine at church had this investment idea. I bought into this investment idea, and he also knew the treasurer of this company. And so when he heard that I was no longer employed, he offered to introduce me to the treasurer, which led to ultimately getting the CEO of the company to hear about my business development background and hiring me as a consultant, supposed to be for 30 days. Turned into 15 months working for this guy.
Interesting.
And it turns out he was running the largest stock fraud in the history of the state of Washington.
Interesting. So I was reading a little bit in the book. What he was actually doing was he had a medical device company?
Integrated healthcare company.
Integrated healthcare company, and he was promising that it was about to go onto the public market, that people who made early investments would be able to get massive returns. Mm-hmm. And so your role was in the role of investor relations.
Right.
And so what were you do? What would tell us a little bit more about what happened next?
Yeah, so he hired me originally just to set up an investor relations group because all they had was an answering machine. Literally a physical machine, and they were taking phone calls from investors and couldn't keep up with the volume. So I came in, set up the department, set up processes and procedures and so forth, and then that just led into working with constantly the investor community and answering questions and then following his instructions and orders and so forth. So my day in and day out was literally long days sometimes, but fielding a lot of questions, dealing with the database, and managing a lot of, about 8 people.
And at any point in this process, was there anything in the back of your mind that said this isn't quite right?
All the time.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a lot of, in hindsight, what would be obvious red flags. But in the context of the moment, I had no idea that I was actually helping him commit a crime. And so of the 34 employees, 12 of us went to prison. And we expect, we meaning several of the other inmates, the other federal felons, have spoken since, and we suspect that only 3 of the 12 actually knew something was going on, that he was committing a crime.
Okay, so let's back up there just for a second, because I'm so curious about that. How you found yourself in a place where that tingly sense in the back of your neck that says maybe this isn't quite right was going off, but the environment that you were in kind of suffocated that sensation, and so you kept moving forward. What have you kind of learned from that experience about the nature of the blind spots that we all have, or our willingness to overlook an obvious wrong because of a potential future benefit to ourselves?
Yeah, so 2 questions in that one question, really, and very good observation about the environment. What I realized in hindsight was that there was a lot of influences in my decision-making processes that I was completely unaware of. The environment was one of them. I was going fast and furious. I was at the peak of my game. I had just sold my company.
Yes, sure.
So I felt like I was on cloud nine. I
Yes.
felt like I was invincible in many ways. You know, the entrepreneur who finally reached the pinnacle of success, and not realizing that that confidence was also masking greed and arrogance and, you know, overconfidence. You know, it was masking a lot of character issues. It was also not just the environment and the craziness of the excitement of getting ready to go public. I bought 10,000 shares originally in that company before I ever knew the owner, just from my buddy at church, but he gifted us lots more shares. And plus I also introduced some friends and family to the opportunity, and so I ended up getting more shares as a result of those introductions, which by the way is not legal nor right, but it seemed good at the moment.
Sure, noted.
And then there was all these other influences that went into my thinking process, such as the entirety of my background. The entirety of my drive, like I was an entrepreneur and I was driven for success, and that is not in of itself a bad thing, but I realized at one point in the visiting room, now that I'm in prison, that my parents shared a story where when I was a little kid, I don't remember this, but when I was a little kid, they said, you know, you used to tell us, Mom and Dad, I'm going to be a multimillionaire someday and buy you that motorhome you're looking at, and because I couldn't afford it, and I don't remember saying that, but it opened my eyes to the fact that, boy, I was really money focused at a very young age. Yeah. And so what motivates us to do what we do, I had no idea that I was motivated by the greed and wanting that success for all the wrong reasons. And it all seemed right in the moment.
Interesting.
You know.
Okay, so let's continue this forward. You're in this process, really heady time. You're at the peak of your powers. You're contributing in ways that you see are really significant. And yet it's into this whole thing that turns out to be a house of cards. Mm-hmm. How does it come tumbling down?
One morning, my wife and I, about 7 o'clock in the morning, we were sleeping, just waking up, and we hear this loud knock on the door.
Uh-oh.
And it was the FBI, and there was about 5 FBI agents at our door. And they came bursting through the door with a warrant.
Just like you see in the movies.
Just like you see in the movies. It was surreal. And they wanted to search the house. They were looking for anything they could get their hands on that related to the company. I had no idea that I was in trouble, but I figured they knew that I was investor relations, so they wanted whatever they can get their hands on. Long and short of it is, after they left, I went down and hired an attorney, find out what's going on, and certainly I was actually a target of the investigation. I didn't know it. They weren't obligated to tell me. And so, and what that meant, I learned from my attorney, was that I was being looked into as to my involvement with my boss's crime at that point. Hadn't been indicted, wasn't going to be arrested anytime soon at that moment. But it became very apparent very quickly that I needed an attorney, and I couldn't afford a professional attorney. I needed to get a government attorney, public defender. And so one was assigned to me, and after Carol and I worked through some very significant differences. She emotionally beat me up, basically, trying to test my resolve and find the truth. There was a moment in her office where she made a comment that I realize now why we're not seeing eye to eye. And she said to me, she goes, "You're looking at this through a moral perspective, and I'm looking at this through a legal perspective."
Interesting. Yeah, okay, so unpack this a little bit more. What does she mean by that?
That's what she began to unfold. She said, now morally, I believe you. I really believe, and I can even convince the jury that you didn't know your boss is committing a crime. But legally, it doesn't matter because you did what you did. And you're not going to be charged with fraud. There's no intent necessary. You're going to be charged with conspiracy. And so you just did what you did. It's like the Bagman not knowing what's in the bag, but he still carried the bag. The old mafia thing or organized crime.
That feels so unfair, though. You didn't know. You were just doing your job as a professional, and yet your boss's schemes are now putting you in this very compromised position.
Right. And so now I don't want to sugarcoat this. I'm not innocent. I was guilty. Okay, but we're talking about the concept of our thinking process, right?
Yeah.
And understanding context and what's really influencing our decisions. And so with all of that context, I had no idea he was committing a crime. However, there were some smoking guns when it all was said and done. I mean, there were some points where I had to make a moral decision. And I don't want to belabor that now. I mean, it's in the book. But there's a point where in December of 2001, I had to make a moral decision as to whether the gentleman that I hired to run one of the divisions of the company, he and I were talking, and he had to sign off on a document for the state of Washington. And we knew that if he signed that document attesting that the CEO was not involved in this other entity, which was supposed to absolve the company of all of its problems, that if he signed that, then we would potentially be committing perjury. Oh. But if he didn't sign it, we could be putting the knife into a very healthy project that would kill it. And so we had this dilemma. Do we protect 5,000 investors and let this company go forward and go public? Or do we, by signing the document, or do we not sign the document and just basically say, we're pulling the plug? But we didn't, so we had suspicions, but we didn't know. We didn't know enough to know what to do, and we were too scared, maybe, too fearful of seeking outside counsel. And that's a long story, but there's a lot of manipulation by the boss that went into this project constantly. So there's this shroud of mystery. There was this conspiracy thinking process about the evil government, and they're just trying to stop us from going public because the healthcare industry's got all these locks on, on and on.
Sure. Yeah. So what I'm hearing in there is that one of the things that contributed to the sense of blindness that you were feeling there is having to exist in almost a covert environment where getting effective outside counsel wasn't encouraged.
Not only not encouraged, it was completely discouraged and forbidden in many ways.
Interesting.
He was masterful at keeping everybody compartmentalized. We weren't even allowed to talk to the sales guys selling stock. We weren't really to interface with other employees at the headquarters. It was just, he kept everybody compartmentalized doing just the part that they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And he always made it really clear that we have significant competitors out there who are trying to destroy the project.
In light of that behavior, what implications does that have for somebody who wants to avoid falling into a similar kind of situation where their best efforts end up being self-destructive, especially when it comes to this idea of like in a high secrecy environment? What are some of the downsides, and what would be an effective way to counteract that in your own life?
Well, I can't speak intelligently to legitimate secrecy environments.
Sure.
Because I'm certain there are times
but
when you have
I
to,
think as
right?
leaders, though, we all carry things that we hold tightly because we feel that if we surface them, if we bring them out into the sunshine, then suddenly people's perspective of us, our stock will decrease.
Right, yeah.
But it's those things being held in secret that I have observed often create the most self-destructive patterns possible.
Sure.
And so I'm just curious about your reflection through this process of the role of kind of authenticity and transparency in one's leadership as an antidote to avoiding the kind of self-destructive behaviors that you participate in.
Yeah, so from that standpoint, from a personal standpoint, absolutely, vulnerability is critical. And what I've discovered is that I need to surround myself with other people, other leaders, other men, other friends, and people that are willing to speak truth to me and that I'm investing my trust in. And it's a hard place. It's a scary place, but you have to be vulnerable in order to be protected. Yeah. Because what happened back in this period of time is I didn't feel that I could trust anybody. And I was led to believe that there was a lot of people out there that were out to get us. And it was a crazy thinking process in hindsight. But it's part of the context of the environment, right?
I see.
And so it's not unlike a pastor. It's not unlike a church leader who is dealing with whatever private issues they're dealing with that they're afraid to tell somebody about, right? You alluded to, and the media exposes all of these things eventually.
Right.
At some
Yeah.
point,
Absolutely. All right, so let's continue the story forward. Things are unraveling in your work world. The FBI's shown up to your home. Your public defender says, look, you're guilty whether you knew it or not. So from a legal perspective, this is nearing the end of the road. So what happens next? What was the end result of this legal proceeding? And I'm assuming, as we've already mentioned it, 33 months in a federal prison. How did you get there, and what were some of the lessons that you learned inside federal prison?
So from that moment when my attorney really helped me understand the concept that two people can see the same event through completely different lenses and different perspectives. That's when my eyes were open and I realized I had to sign a plea bargain. So I was the first one to be offered a plea. In other words, a contract with the government to confess my guilt. And the best offer that they were providing was 10 years. So that was my dilemma. I wanted to fight it because I knew I was innocent of intent. But when she explained what she explained, I realized I don't have a choice. I do have to sign this. I am guilty. I did what I did. And so I signed a 10-year plea bargain. And then I was out on my own recognizance for 2 years while the government built their case, and I was a key witness in helping them piece the puzzle together.
So for 2 years, you're just in limbo, knowing that at some point you're going to have to serve federal time, but not knowing when that hammer will drop.
Exactly.
That sounds miserable.
It was a horrible 2 years for my wife Rachel, my 2 kids Chris and Noel, and myself. And it was a horrible 2 years. We didn't know when, and we didn't know how long, because we knew that 10 years was what I agreed to, but we didn't know what the sentence would be, because it would be the promise was it would be reduced by some degree based on my cooperation.
Yes.
So 2 years later, we go to sentencing. And that's a whole other story in and of itself. But we go to sentencing, and I end up getting sentenced to 48 months, which my attorney explained was a gift that the judge had never departed 60% from the original plea. And so we didn't see it as a gift, but we were certainly
4
thankful.
years.
Yeah, we were still thankful for not 10 years, right? And so then I was ordered to show up on my own at the prison. It's called self-surrender. I didn't even know that was a possibility. I expected to be handcuffed and escorted out, but she basically said, 30 days from now, I want you to show up at the prison and check yourself in. And so that was another 30 days of a different kind of misery, because now, yes, we were very relieved to have an answer, but now we have 30 days to sort of prepare for the next 4 years. And my wife was the breadwinner, or I was the breadwinner. She was a stay-at-home mother, raising our, at that point, 11 and 13-year-old.
Oh, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
Wow. So you finally self-surrender.
Yeah.
You're in federal penitentiary. I'm assuming good behavior and some other things kind of reduced that sentence further down to what ended up being 33 months. What were some of the lessons that you learned while inside prison?
Yeah, inside prison was also surreal. It's hard to describe to anybody who hasn't been there, although I was recently blessed to be able to visit Cuba, and it was likened to prison. It was interesting because it was a culture. There's a culture all to itself, a culture that doesn't have a lot of revenue, not a lot of the entitlement mentality that we have sometimes in the U.S. And it's the same thing in prison. There's all these men in there, 504 roommates that don't have means. We're all sort of now having to create a new community and learn to cohabitate and do it civilly. And I was in a minimal security prison, so there was no real violence. There was none of the mischief stuff that you see on TV, that dramatized. But while I was in there, I recognized many different things. One of the things that was obvious as I was approaching the end of my sentence was that the majority of the men, when they left the same as when they got there.
Interesting.
Yeah, I like to think of it as sort of this path, this you've got two choices. So there's sort of a path. If I can borrow from Scott Peck's book, Road Less Traveled, there's two. There's a wide and a narrow path. There's this huge sidewalk that leads from the administration to two dormitories, and that's the style of living was dormitories, bunk beds, no cells, no locks on the windows or doors. I mean, it was definitely a minimal security. And most of the guys metaphorically took that wide path because when they got to the dorms, they could just continue to be who they always have been. They continue to party, because I hate to say it, but you can smuggle just about anything you want into a federal prison. It's sad but true. It's not good when they get caught, but so they can continue to party. They could stay up all night. They could play cards. They could watch TV. They could just read fiction books. And this is all the stuff that they did. They just goofed off. And then there was another path that sort of led to the administrative areas, the education areas, the chapel, recreation and fitness, and some of those areas. And I call that the narrow path because the majority of the guys ignored that one. Unless they were forced to finish out their GED,
Sure.
which a few of them were. Most of the guys would not do any kind of self-improvement. They would not do any kind of self-reflection to find out what was their thinking, what was, how they got there, and what can they do better in their life to make better decisions.
Yeah.
And so that was the biggest thing, is to realize, what, we have a choice to make. And that choice is going to allow us to stay the same, live the life we've always lived. We kind of, settle into the cadence of conformity, or we can make a choice to create a different cadence and walk out of that prison with a whole new stride.
What encouragement would you give someone who sees the wide and the narrow path, feels drawn towards the narrow path, but is so ingrained in the other side that they're having difficulty staying consistent and developing that discipline to actually see the positive results that they want?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right off the bat, there's so many things, so many steps involved in that you can help yourself stay strong in that area. But, Scripture says, without a vision, my people wander aimlessly or perish, depends on the version, right? And so that's the first thing, is really get a vision for who you want to be and what kind of a life you want to live, rather than just accepting who you are and without challenging who you're becoming.
Yeah.
So a vision is really critical.
Okay.
You really have to have something in front of you that's going to drive you. And that vision shouldn't be and really can't be just intellectual. It really needs to be emotional. It needs to be something you really can latch onto, that you can hold on to it and say, I really want to be that person, right? It's like, I really want to have that profession. I really want to have this kind of a family. I really want to raise kids this way. It's got to be passionate to help you. And then you need to surround yourself with others who will hold you accountable. And it's not the kind of accountability that people are going to beat you over the head for doing wrong.
Yeah.
It's self-accountability. It's me checking in and saying, how am I doing, right? I've got an idea. I want to run it by you and just see if I'm thinking clearly. And it's that kind of account. It's me holding myself accountable, but having others around me that can speak truth to me, that can bring new perspectives to me, because I now know that I don't know what I don't know.
Ooh, that's a healthy self-realization.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So those are some of the.
All right. So you spent all of this time in prison. You traveled that narrow path to trying to maximize, in a certain sense, you probably didn't feel like this at the time, but the gift that was given to you to focus on your own self-improvement inside that context. A little less than 3 years goes by, and now you're out. How does life rebuild, and what does it look like on the other side of this whole ordeal?
Great question. So while I was in prison, I was, again, blessed to be associated with a guy that I warmly refer to as the Godfather. He was a man who was pretty much a bad to the bone kind of a guy, and signed a 20-year plea bargain. He was at the tail end of his sentence, so he had spent a lot of years in prison, but he became a Christian early on in his prison sentence. And so totally change of life, and he gave me some great advice about how to do time, as he put it. In other words, how do you process this? How do you deal with 33 months of confinement? And one of the things he said to me is, I needed to put my family on the altar. He said, you can't control anything that's going on the outside. He said, you can't offer them advice unless they ask. He said, you basically need to put them on the altar and just trust God that they're going to stick by you, that you're going to have a relationship when you get out. And then the second thing he said is, when you do get out, he said, you need to just not feel like you're going to step right back into the role you had when you left.
Sure.
He said, they've been running their lives for the last 33 months.
Without you.
Without me.
Yeah.
So it was really good advice. So when I got out, there was a tension, there was an excitement, but there was a tension because, again, she had a rhythm, she had a cadence to her life, and the kids had a cadence to their life. And who am I to come in to step in on that cadence and interrupt it, right? So I had to sort of understand and learn their cadence, and it created some friction at times, but we were able to meld our cadences over time.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of grace and a lot of patience went into that process.
Absolutely.
That's a really healthy thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now let's kind of turn a corner here. You've now taken this experience. You've written a book called Blindspots: Why Good People Make Bad Choices. We've heard a lot of your story. What principles have you extracted from that you think are really crucial for other people to avoid some of the mistakes that you made?
The mistakes about Going to prison?
No, that's probably not
elaborate.
the best. I think I'm curious about, as you've in the process of reflecting on your journey and writing this book with a strong desire to help other leaders kind of identify and mitigate their own blind spots. Okay, what wisdom have you learned in that process that you'd want to share?
Yeah, so while I was, again, spending 33 months, one of the factors that was able to reduce my sentence, as you mentioned, was good behavior. So it's in the federal system, there's no parole. So you get 15% off for good behavior. And I also was accepted into a 500-hour cognitive behavioral psychology course. And that gave me a few extra months off. So, and it was revolutionary to my thinking. Before I understood how we think and make decisions from a cognitive standpoint, from a psychology standpoint, I just was more of an intuitive type thinker.
Oh, sure.
Right? Just kind of gut feel, very, student of the scripture, so a lot of very good solid principles,
sure,
but never really a cognitive process or a real intentional, rational thinking process in many ways as a leader. So I kind of went with fly by the seat of your pants kind of thing, even though I had strategy and all these other things.
It sounds like the very characteristics that made you a successful entrepreneur.
In many ways. And in addition to that, I was very trusting, in many ways gullible. I realized in hindsight that intelligence has nothing to do with gullibility. I met some of the smartest investors that I've ever met working for this guy, and they were investing hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so gullibility is no respecter of intelligence. And so I realized that I also had a lot of blind faith. And today I feel like my faith is more rational faith. And by that, I mean, take you back to when I told you in 1984, I made a decision. Now, what I've discovered is that over the years, 30 plus years serving the Lord, is some people have radical conversions, right? Well, that was me. That was the road to Damascus conversion. Other people have more of intellectual or process conversions. They start working toward following Christ, and they couldn't pinpoint necessarily a day. They just know that they love the Lord, right? Yeah, well, mine was radical, but because in some ways of the way I was thinking, I took a leap of faith without any rational basis behind it. And that's not a bad thing, except if that becomes the thread of your life, then you're susceptible to just hearing a lot of input and not really processing that input for your own decisions, right?
Yeah.
So I had to go and literally I spent probably close to 1,000 hours just unpacking while I was in prison, unpacking this concept of what do I believe and why do I believe it? And what if it's not really true? And from that, I came out with a very strong faith, but it was a more rational faith. It was based on a lot more rational processing. And so today, I consider myself to be a little bit more skeptical.
Sure.
And we don't want to be cynical.
Yeah,
but I think skepticism
it's a healthy distinction.
A little bit healthy.
Sure.
And so when you're in a position of leadership and you have decisions that are going to impact yourself and others, take those decisions and don't take them lightly, and bring in a lot of other perspectives, a lot of other input. Listen to the input.
Yeah.
Be willing to change.
Yeah.
Be vulnerable and humble. Be willing to change because you might have a strong opinion about what should happen. But if you're getting feedback and literally listening to the feedback, by the way, I was getting feedback from people that I knew and some that I trusted that they thought it was a fraud. Other people thought that this was not legit. They had no proof, nothing more than a gut feel.
Yep.
But I wasn't listening to gut feels at that point. I wanted proof.
Confirmation bias was working against you.
Because my gut was telling me keep going.
Sure.
Right? But they couldn't provide proof to slap me silly and tell me it's wrong. So I just didn't listen to them. So don't stick so close to your gut that you ignore people, even with just discernment with no proof.
Yeah.
Listen to it.
Awesome. One of the threads that's come through your career is this emphasis in public speaking and training. So you've spent a lot of time in front of a group of people trying to communicate your ideas for their benefit and hopefully for life change. And that in a nutshell, is what I spend a lot of time on Sundays, preaching and teaching in the classroom at Canby Bible College. The same kind of thing. So I'm interested in hearing your perspective from somebody who's functioned a lot in the business context, how you think about the discipline of public speaking. And let's start first with what goes into your preparation process for giving a speech or a training to an audience. What is it that you think about? How much time do you spend preparing? And what are some of the principles that you try to pass your kind of behavior through in order to get to something that you're proud to present to someone else?
When I'm developing some new presentation, okay, and in fact, I'm going through it right now. I'm giving a brand new speech at the end of March. And so when developing this presentation, to borrow from Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I do is, what is it I want the audience to walk away with? Now, in the case of being a professional speaker, my clients sort of dictate that.
Sure.
All right. So they have a theme or a goal or an intention, and we collaborate. And then my goal is to help meet those objectives.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I work from that, and then I work backwards. And great speaking is riddled with stories and humor.
Yes.
So work backwards. I look through my inventory of stories, and I say, okay, what stories would really help drive home these points?
Now, stop right there for a second, because you're not the first person who has alluded to one of the things that speakers will do is that they'll create a database, is maybe not the right word, but a kind of a set of stories that they have in their repertoire that have either a particular point or illustrate a particular theme, and they're able to draw on those in the same way that a carpenter draws on a particular set of tools based on the situation. Is that what you've developed over the years?
Absolutely. In fact, I was literally thinking about this again this morning in my quiet time with regard to this presentation coming up about a story. So I've got this inventory. I've got a story I call the scuba story.
Okay.
All right. It's a scuba diving story where I almost died.
Sure.
And from that, you develop all these stories. You basically look through the thread of your life, because we all have stories, all kinds of stories.
Yes.
You look through the thread of your life. You say, oh, that's an interesting story. May or may not be applicable after you really process through it, but you write it down. And then what lessons can I draw out of that story? And sometimes we have this mindset that you have to have learned the lesson in the moment of the story, and reality is that's not how life works.
No, it's through the reflection.
Yeah, it's through the reflection, and sometimes you just have to think about the story sometimes years later.
Yeah.
And realize, oh, well, that's a great metaphor.
Yes.
For A, B, or C.
Okay.
And you can write different lessons that can be drawn from that one metaphor of
Sure.
your story.
Okay. So lots of humor, a catalog of stories that you're drawing from to help illustrate the points that you're trying to make to achieve the end that, in this case, the client has set out for you. What are some other things that you go through in that preparation and honing practice for presenting?
So then I begin to visualize the presentation, bits and pieces at first until
Okay.
it starts to all formulate.
Yeah.
As I'm literally walking through it in my mind's eye, so I'm seeing myself get on the stage. I'm looking for the interaction with the audience in my mind's eye.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going through this process, and I'm jotting it down because I'm
Sure.
developing out the script, if you will.
Yeah.
Although I don't write a verbatim script,
Okay.
but it's sort of the outline.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm looking for making sure that I have built in intentional humor,
Sure.
right? As I heard one of the preachers at our church say not too long ago, spontaneous intentional humor.
Yes.
Right? So you have to build in the humor into it. You have to make sure you've driven home the point with your different stories. And then as I get to that point of having the outline, then it's a practice. Then in my office,
Yeah.
in front of a mirror.
Tell me a little bit about this. I've heard in my thinking about public speaking that one of the things that separates amateurs from professionals, if you will, is the ability of, like, amateurs will practice until they get it right, but professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. So I'm curious to hear, let's say you're doing a keynote, it's 30 minutes long. How much time would you spend just practicing? You've done all the work, you've written it out, but the actual time just running it through, how much time do you normally spend, or would you recommend speakers spend to make sure that they really internalize their content?
Tough question to answer, because I think it's to say carte blanche, this is what it's going to look like.
Yes.
It's going to be different based on experience.
Sure.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've got enough experience on the stage in front of audiences and I understand my content to where I can put the program together, and depending on how much time I have available before I have to deliver it.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Right? That'll depend on how much time I actually have to practice it.
Yes.
But generally speaking, 5, 10, 15, 20 hours, again, depending on that variance.
Wow.
Of just kind of running through it. And it's
Yes.
not all physical. Like, I'm not always pacing the floor as if it's my stage.
Right.
It's a lot of mental. It's just constantly rehearsing it. And then even as I get to the venue,
Sure.
and that morning, for example, if I'm giving an 8:30 keynote, at 6 o'clock, I'm setting up equipment, getting ready, and then I'm off by myself, and I'm just mentally going through it. I'm literally practicing the opening statement, for example. So just really, and I don't memorize my speeches. I memorize my stories. The great stories are memorized.
Yeah.
They're the same every time.
Now, I'm interested in, you had mentioned earlier that you don't manuscript your speeches. So you're running off of an outline that says, that kind of like, there's a mental map that you have that kind of that moves through the speech, and you know that there's a point here and a story that illustrates, and then there's this humor break, and you kind of do this as you go through. How that's the process that you've come to. Do you find, or would you recommend for someone just getting started out who doesn't have the chops and the confidence and the ability to think so quickly on their feet, perhaps, is there a role for the manuscript, and maybe what's the downside of leaning too heavily on one?
So I definitely have more of a gift, and maybe it's experience both combined with extemporaneous speaking.
Sure.
And
which is the ability to kind of speak off the cuff in the moment. You're quick on your feet. Okay.
Quick on my feet. And I feel actually confined if I'm trying to read a speech.
Oh, interesting.
That's just, it goes against my character, my grain of who I am, right? But there is a great place for that. Some of the greatest sermons I've ever heard are scripted out, word for word. And in fact, I love Charles Stanley, for example. You listen to his stuff, 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, he can unpack
so dense
a concept so deeply that, and it's all well thought out. So there's a place for that. The aspiring speaker or preacher is a great place to start. The process we're going to go through typically is, originally it's going to be first about us.
Yeah.
How am I going to do? How are people going to receive this? How is my poise and my posture and all that? So we think too much about ourselves, but that's just the normal steps. And then we begin to think about our speech, our presentation, our sermon, and we want to perfect that. And when we get past those two stages, in realizing, really, I just want to impact people.
It's about the audience and not us.
It's all about the audience. Yeah. It's about the congregation. It's about others. It doesn't really matter how perfected you are, how perfect your script is, your manuscript, as you call it.
Fascinating.
Right? It's really about the audience. And then when you move from this performance mode, where now I'm a big believer in Toastmasters, but Toastmasters will teach you, poise and no ums, and I've said a few today. Toastmasters is great for that, but when you move past me and my body of work and to the audience, then it becomes just about having a conversation.
Interesting, and that's what impacts. Let's come back now. You've mentioned that humor and stories. We talked a little bit about stories. Tell us a little bit about how developing your own style when it comes to humor, because I think we've all seen situations where a speaker has tried for humor and either didn't fall or they didn't. And when it goes badly, it's bad. And so tell us a little bit about your experience of using humor effectively and what tips you might give to a beginning speaker to incorporate it effectively.
First of all, don't laugh at your own jokes. Because you're laughing, you think the audience is going to laugh. It's just natural.
Yes.
But don't laugh at your own jokes. If you really pay attention to some of the best comics out there, they're telling a story. You're laughing your head off, and they're not laughing.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah. I've often thought that comedy and preaching, it's the same discipline with a different script.
Yeah.
It's one of the only places that I can imagine that people will willingly listen to someone else's monologue.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I often will watch stand-up comics to try to extract what it is that they're doing and how it is that they're so effective. Okay, so we're not laughing at our own jokes.
Don't laugh at your own jokes. Look for places in your script, in your presentation. Look for places that people relate to. Those funny things in life that sometimes we don't talk about, but when you say it, everybody goes, "Oh yeah." And it gets a chuckle, gets an emotion drawn, right? So you don't have to be telling jokes.
Right.
You just have to bring in real life scenarios that are humorous.
Sure.
Into your stories.
Yes. I find that some of the most humorous ones are the most, if you have the ability to laugh, not at your own jokes, but at yourself. Mm-hmm. So the self-deprecating kinds of things, where you don't end up to be the hero of every one of your own stories, right. I think is a very humanizing way to kind of cross the divide between you on the stage with a microphone and then everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So we've got a lot of stories. We've got a sense of really wanting to connect with the audience. So we're not going to hide behind our notes or our manuscript. We're going to practice this so deeply that it becomes internalized. And then when we get on the stage itself, you'd mentioned earlier, I'm still so nervous. And that takes and even now I've spent a lot of time on stages, but even just this Sunday I was preaching and felt just this almost a paralysis prior to going on stage. Mm-hmm. What have you learned about helping push through that so that you're able to deliver that opening line with confidence? What's going on in your head as you're about to step onto stage and begin?
Yeah, thanks. The process that I go through, as I mentioned, is sort of rehearsing before I'm getting on the stage and then just relaxing, deep breaths and just, and frankly, and I don't tell a lot of my audiences this, but literally just trusting God.
Yeah.
Right. My wife even prayed that I'd have the right words today. Right. Just trusting God to know that He's going to use you as a vessel, and that it's not about how well you are going to do. It's about how the words are going to impact the spirit, and also ultimately it's going to impact the lives. So I get up there, I practice, I relax, and then a big mistake that a lot of speakers make is small talk in the beginning of their presentation. Thank you for having me. It was a great day today.
Sure.
Or is everybody doing well? I mean, just the little silly things that we think are icebreakers.
Sure.
But in reality, it's creating more tension.
It's just forestalling that's not what you came here to say. So kind of get on with it is often what the audience ends up thinking, right?
And so it's creating more tension instead of relaxing the tension. So just get up there and have the first words out of your mouth jump right into your story, your statistics, your whatever.
And I remember I saw you present your story on Blindspots and Summit recently, and the first words out of your mouth immediately captured the audience's attention. And we were like on a journey with you through this experience of spending time in a federal prison. And I was struck by that because a lot of times there's a thank you so much for having, the commendation to your host and all of that. And instead you took us immediately into a journey. And as an audience member, I felt, this might not be the right way to say it, but felt like I was in capable and trustworthy hands, right? He's taking me someplace and I'm happy to go along with it, even though I don't altogether know where it's going to take me as an audience. And I think that is a key step. And I felt that in your presentation of audience engagement, right? I wanted to know where this was going to end, and I didn't right at the front. Yeah. And so you captured that attention really well by just jumping right in.
Thank you. Yeah, and you just mentioned it too. Audience engagement is a misunderstood concept at times with aspiring speakers. Audience engagement isn't that, high five or let's have a couple of questions, that kind of thing. Audience engagement is what you just described. Audience engagement is being able to pull the audience into the moment, being able to capture their imagination, being able to draw them into the story, if you will, being able to hold their attention.
Yes.
And then there are times when you bring in tools or you bring in, work that they're going to do. That's a different type of engagement. But that's the ultimate engagement, is really drawing them in.
Yeah. So let's say you're in the middle of your speech. You think it's going pretty well. You get to the end, and the response isn't quite what you were hoping for. How do you go back and use the work that you've already done on stage to try to get better for the next time around? What kind of iterative practice or evaluation techniques do you do on yourself to make sure that you're continually growing as a public speaker?
That's great. I just bring my spouse. Rachel started traveling with me, and she started being able to give me feedback afterwards. But before she started giving me feedback, one thing I learned years ago is, first of all, never judge your audience. So I'll give a presentation, and it would be the same presentation with audience A that I'll give to audience B. Audience A was roaring in their seats, where they were totally engaged.
Sure.
I mean,
Yes.
it was a high energy moment.
Yes.
Same presentation to audience B, and there's hardly a boo. And,
That's got to be so. That's got to be so deflating as a speaker.
As a speaker, it's tough because you're thinking, "What happened? Everybody else just laughed at that same humor moment. You guys aren't even smiling. What's going on here?" And so, but if you judge your audience, then it's going to affect the entire presentation from their perspective as well.
Yes.
And what I learned is, it doesn't matter what their reactions are. That message is still going out there, because I'd have people come up afterwards and praise me and do all these things. I'm like, really? Couldn't have told that by your face. So don't judge the audience, and then pay attention to what you're doing throughout. So it's sort of this juxtaposition where you're giving out, but you also have to receive while you're doing it. Okay. So you're listening, you're paying attention. If you try a humor line, as an example, that you've never tried before, pay attention, make a mental note of the reaction, and then afterwards, I run through my presentations. Now, I recorded them all. And I don't always watch the recordings, but I certainly have them. But you record your presentations, you listen to the recordings, whether it's video or audio. I try to do both, always audio, sometimes video. But I'm always running through it in my mind, and I'm working out those little areas for refinement. Okay, that joke isn't going over. I've tried it too many times and still get the same reaction. Yes. Scrap it. Don't ever bring it up again. Mm-hmm. Right? That kind of a thing. That story didn't really resonate. Nobody really was drawn into the story. Yeah. I thought it was cool. Right. But it didn't really impact. Okay, scrap that. Let's not use that story again.
So you're constantly evolving and iterating on, even if you feel like it's an effective speech, you feel like it can always get better. Mm-hmm. And you as a presenter can always get better. When you watch some of those tapes, what are you looking for in terms of body language? I'm curious about how, like, often beginning speakers don't know what to do with their hands, or if they're at a podium, they'll tend to kind of hide behind the podium. You've talked about a process in which you've internalized your content so deeply, and you're wanting to connect with your audience so genuinely. Sometimes having that physical barrier like a podium represents a kind of a physical barrier. So I'm curious how you what are some of the practices that you stand when you're on stage? How do you stand? What do you do with your hands? How much movement do you think is effective to continue that audience engagement?
And you said it well. I'm still working to get better at this, and I think as a speaker, we're always our worst critic, right? So because we want to get better, and so watching my videos is painful. James, just painful.
It is.
Like I was watching one of my videos just 4 or 5 months ago, and realized that my arms were sort of just dangling and swinging. Like, 6-inch movement on my arm. As I'm standing and telling the story, my arms are just kind of dangling. And I was like, what am I doing? Why are my arms dangling?
Sure, yes.
Why are they not just still?
Right? Oh, sure.
It was just sort of weird. It was a little nervous tick or something. Mm-hmm. At one point, a couple of years ago, I had a buddy coach me and reflect on one of my presentations. And he goes, what are you doing with your hands? You look like a T-Rex.
Oh,
I had my hands like this. I'm thinking I'm demonstrating a point, but my hands stayed in that point. Oh, even though I was long past the point, my hands were just locked in that position, and I never noticed it. Right, so you watch the little ticks, and then when you first get on the stage or you first get in front of the pulpit or whatever, just pause. Just pause. So when I get up there, I always look at the audience, make eye contact, I pause, my feet are planted, my arms are generally still, and then I jump right into the message. Right. And another tick, if you will, another little idiosyncrasy that we need to watch for is movement. Make all your movement intentional. We have in the theater world, and I'm not from the theater world, I'm studying theater people, right? But they're stage left, stage right, forward, stage, and back. And so there's a use of the stage for movement that actually draws the audience in unconsciously to the story.
Yeah, the eye is drawn to movement. And
and I've done this many times preaching, right? When we get up on the stage, for some reason, we feel the need to walk over to this side of the audience, and sometimes the stage is only 6 feet wide.
Yeah.
And so you're back and forth. And
You're
and
pacing.
the audience is like, what is he doing? They're not thinking that consciously. But it's like a little ping pong movement, right? And it's unnecessary. Yes. We feel like it's necessary because that's how we're connecting with this side. We don't want them to feel left out while we're connecting with this side. In reality, just center the stage, stand perfectly still, move when movement is required.
Sure.
And movement is required when you're bringing people forward or backward in time, as an example. You would move stage left or stage right.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. When you're in front of a group of people, a lot of people get really intimidated that all eyes on me is not altogether a comfortable feeling. And so we tend to speak to the crowd. And so our eyes will be above everybody's head looking at the back wall 15 feet off the ground. And yet having that ability to look distinctly in somebody's eyes is a difficult skill to master while still having the words come out of your mouth in a way that makes sense in a logical order. What skills or what practices have you developed to help maintain strong and effective eye contact during your presentations?
And that is another progression, if you will, in the process of becoming a better public speaker.
Yeah.
And I remember being taught that in my 20s, getting in front of those audiences when I was invited to speak at the churches. Hey, if you're nervous, just look over their heads, look at the back wall, and everybody will think you're looking at them. It's, not really.
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, it'll think, they'll at least think you're looking at the back row. But that's just one of the processes, because if you're nervous, then it's hard to make eye contact. As you get to, as I mentioned earlier, you get to the point in your development, your learning, that you can just simply have a conversation. Then would you look over somebody's head when you're talking with them? Probably not. Yeah. So you want to make eye contact as much and with as many people in the audience as you can while you're speaking. And it's just a practice. It's a mental process in the beginning. Then it becomes just natural.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as you're having a conversation, it's easy just to look at Sally in the audience or Joe in the audience and just talk with Joe and talk with Sally.
Absolutely. A couple more technical questions. I'm curious about the role the visuals play. So a PowerPoint deck or anything else that you would have on stage to help either reinforce the point or draw audience engagement in. How do you think about that discipline?
That is a mixed bag of opinions within the National Speakers Association. I've got colleagues that will never use PowerPoint. They are just against it. They think PowerPoint is nothing but a crutch. And so they want to get up on the stage and present their keynote or their presentation without any notes by memorizing. And there's some techniques you can use to memorize the key points. And then I've got others, and myself included, who use PowerPoint effectively. There's those who use it ineffectively.
Yes.
We call it death by PowerPoint.
Yes, I've been in a few of those, and it's brutal.
It's like you've got a whole book on the. It's like, you can't read this, but let me read it for you.
Oh gosh, anytime you hear those words, it's bad.
Oh no, that's just amateur speaker. But that's just part of the process. And so, for me, I battle with that. So I'm working towards not using PowerPoint at times. And because I want to be able to present some of my keynotes without using any kind of PowerPoint because it's a different modality.
Sure.
But I use PowerPoint often, and I try to make sure that my PowerPoint slides usually only have one word on them.
Yes.
And a big picture, a photograph. So they're real simple. When a client says, "Can we have your slide deck?"
Be like, it won't make any sense to you.
No, it's worthless. Right. If you want me to create something special, I'll do that. But this one's worthless because it won't make any sense. And so it's just there to reinforce one point or to draw the audience's attention to one word or one comment. Right. Or I'll throw in some humor into it.
Sure.
So I'll use it for visual humor.
Yes, that's a very effective way to keep the audience involved.
But in the beginning, PowerPoint is a helpful tool for the aspiring speaker as you're going through this learning process, because it'll help you keep yourself on point. It'll help you not get lost, right? So use it. If you need to use it, just make sure your slides are relevant and not cumbersome.
Awesome. Okay. As we come to a close, let's think now about kind of in your experience as a public speaker who's not only presented a lot, but seen a lot of presentations. Any words, kind of last words of wisdom or advice for the aspiring public speaker, somebody who's put in front of a crowd to communicate a truth? What would you want to make sure they're left with?
I think you said it best earlier, James, where we just need to find our own style. Be yourself. Have a conversation. When I first started preaching, my concept was to try to be like some of the preachers that I've heard. Some of the really dramatic and really fired up in there. I mean, just constantly boom, 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 and they're throwing out points and they're just being overly melodramatic. And that's their style, and it's great and it's effective. And when I tried to be that, it didn't come across as authentic because it's not me. It's not my style. I'm a little bit meeker in many ways, or a little bit more gentle in the approach, a little bit more fun-loving and humorous. So I had to sort of learn my style, which is to have that conversation and just be authentic and vulnerable and not worry about those high-powered moments, although sometimes I'll flow in and out of those, right? So develop your own style. Don't try to be somebody else's style. That's really key.
That's beautiful. Yeah, there's only one of you, and it'd be a shame to try to waste it trying to be somebody else.
Right.
So, wonderful. Awesome. Kevin, is there a place where people can go to find more about you, your work, and your book, and your career?
Certainly. They can go to kevinmccarthy.com.
Okay.
They can pick up the book on Amazon, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing out of your wisdom and your experience. So grateful for the investment that you're making here in the Canby Bible College community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.